Rest in peace has been a phrase invoked in remembrance of the dead since at least the 5th century. In practice, many of the dead have had far from peaceful times after their committal to the grave. Grave robbing has occurred for a number of reasons: to plunder any valuables interred with the body, to steal the corpse for rituals or medical experimentation, for abuse by necrophiles, and to reuse the land for new burials or for building development. A newspaper report in 1902 claimed that 1,200 bodies had been stolen from their graves in the American state of Indiana alone within the previous 5 years. 20 years earlier, in 1882, it was revealed that possibly thousands of bodies had been stolen from Lebanon Cemetery, a predominantly African-American burial ground in Philadelphia, by sack-em-up men for sale to medical schools. Most of these disturbed corpses are of people whose names have disappeared into the tides of history with barely a ripple, but there are famous individuals whose eternal sleep was rudely disquieted. Not all attempts succeeded. There were failed efforts in 1876 to steal the body of Abraham Lincoln, and in 1891 P.T. Barnum's grave was targeted. 10 famous people who were disturbed. Philippe Pétain, Marshal of France, born in 1856, became a national hero, successfully leading troops at the Battle of Verdun in 1916. He was appointed the French Commander-in-Chief in May 1917, following mutinies that were sparked by his predecessor's strategic errors. Pétain had been sent as ambassador to Spain in 1939. With war again looming in Europe, it was hoped he might be able to sway his former pupil at a French war college, the Spanish leader General Franco, from the side of Hitler and Mussolini and to the French cause. With the German invasion of France in May 1940, Pétain returned and was appointed Deputy Prime Minister. Feeling betrayed by Britain when they evacuated their army from Dunkirk, and believing the military situation to be hopeless for France, Pétain sought to spare his country unnecessary misery by signing an armistice with Germany. Pétain became Prime Minister and signed the armistice on the 22nd of June 1940, leaving roughly 2/5 of France under French sovereignty, while the rest was occupied by Germany. Referred to as Vichy France, after the name of the town where the government moved to from Paris, it was a puppet state, collaborating closely with Germany. From July 1940 to August 1944, Pétain was the chief of the French state. Following the defeat of Germany, he was put on trial for treason and found guilty, being sentenced to death, but on account of his age and his heroism in World War I, was instead held prisoner on a small island, Ile d'Yeu, until his death in 1951. Following his death, he was buried there until the 18th of February 1973. Although condemned by history, Pétain still had many admirers among the French right wing. Ever since his death, there had been agitation to bury him at the military cemetery at Verdun. Some of these people dug up the coffin and demanded that he be reburied at Verdun. Within a few days, police had located the coffin, and Pétain was returned to his island grave. John Scott Harrison, 1804 to 1878, was a farmer and a politician in Ohio's House of Representatives from 1853 to 1857. While he was not a major figure in American politics, he was the son of the 9th President, William Henry Harrison, and the father of the 23rd President, Benjamin Harrison. John died on the 25th of May 1878 at his farm in North Bend, Ohio, and was buried in the family tomb, only a few yards from his father's body the next day. During preparation for the burial, it was discovered that the body of a man named Horace Devens, who had been interred 10 days earlier, had been taken. Due to this, extra precautions were taken with the burial of Harrison. The body was placed in a metallic casket and covered with a stone which required 6 men to lift and then walled up. A guard was employed to watch the tomb for 30 days. Carter Harrison, son of John, and George Eaton, one of John's grandsons, then set about the task of locating their friend Devon's body. They applied for a search warrant, and on the 30th of May, with ex-police chief Snell Baker, they visited the Ohio Medical College in Cincinnati. In the dissecting room, noticing a rope leading to a chute was taut, they pulled on it and revealed a body hung from it, the face covered with a cloth. Carter at first dismissed the find as Devons had been stricken with TB, and the naked body they had discovered was that of a stout man. Baker insisted that Carter checked for certain, so the cloth was removed from the face of the corpse. Carter went pale and stammered, "My God, it's father." John Harrison's flowing white beard had been shaved off, and his jugular cut to bleed out the body, but otherwise it had not been mutilated. Doctors, when asked how the body had come to be in their college, refused to say anything. John's body was taken to a funeral parlour prior to reburial. Meanwhile, the desecration had been discovered. The stone had been shoved aside and a glass window in the casket smashed to allow for the removal of the body. The guard had fled and not been seen. Whether he had been involved or merely negligent was not immediately known. Horace Devons' remains were eventually found in the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Future President Benjamin Harrison was incensed at the treatment of his father's body and filed a lawsuit against the college, the results of which are unknown today, possibly a private settlement being made. Tassos Papadopoulos, 1934 to 2008, was the fifth president of Cyprus from 2003 to 2008. Tassos qualified as a lawyer in London before returning to Cyprus in 1955 and taking part in the anti-colonial struggle against Britain. Thereafter, he spent most of his life involved in Cypriot politics, culminating in his term as president. He was defeated in elections in February 2008, and in December of the same year he died of lung cancer, having smoked heavily his whole life. He was buried in the Hagia Sophia Church in Nicosia. On the 11th of December 2009, it was announced the body had been dug up and stolen. Those responsible must have laboured during a torrential downpour, moving a 250-kilogram marble slab from over the coffin. One of Mr. Papadopoulos' former guards had come to light a candle in the morning for a memorial service planned for that day, made the discovery. Police found the body following a ransom request sent on the 8th of March 2010 in another cemetery in the nearby suburb Ostrovolos, DNA testing confirming that it was the body of Tassos. Those responsible were identified when an Indian man named Sabrajit Singh, who had sent the Papadopoulos family a ransom request, was arrested in 2011. He was an accomplice to two brothers, Prokopiou and Mamaskitas. Prokopiou was serving a jail term for murder and had planned the body stealing as a means of leverage to extort his way out of jail. He and his brother got 20 months and Singh 18 months for their efforts. Eva Peron, 1919 to 1952. The fabled Evita, wife of Argentine President Juan Perón, who co-ruled the nation with him from 1946 to 1952. Evita came from a humble background, and as a girl dreamed of becoming an actress. As a young woman, she obtained employment at a Buenos Aires radio station, where she met her future husband. She helped him campaign for president and was more popular than he was. While running the Ministry of Labour and Ministry of Health, she implemented many improvements in the life of ordinary Argentinians, including legalising divorce, enacting women's suffrage, and providing the poor with funds, goods, education and medicines through her Maria Eva Duarte de Perón Welfare Foundation. In 1951, doctors discovered she had cervical cancer, which according to the official history was the cause of her death the following year, at the age of 33. She was 5'5" and weighed just 36 kilograms at death. In 2015, a Yale neurosurgeon named Daniel Nijenson proposed a theory that Evita was forced into a lobotomy by her husband, the effects of which hastened her demise. Perón had done this for two reasons. One, to make the pain of her cancer more bearable, but more importantly for him to make her more controllable. Possibly as a result of the pain she was in, she had become more intolerant of anyone defying her, and had arranged for weapons to be given to trade unionists to fight the oligarchy in the months before her death. This lobotomy had been a secret until Nijenson received scans of her skull in 2011 and noticed signs that it had been drilled into. Her body was embalmed and lay in state for 13 days, being visited by millions of citizens. Then it was moved to the Confederation of Labour building to await the construction of a monument to her. It was never built, however, and the body remained waiting for burial. Juan Perón was overthrown in a military coup in 1955 and exiled. As part of the repression of the Peronist movement, Eva's body was taken and hidden in random places around Buenos Aires, in a van parked in the street, behind a cinema screen, at the city waterworks, and the offices of military intelligence. In 1957, with assistance from the Vatican, the body was smuggled to Italy and under a false name was buried in a cemetery in Milan. In 1971, Eva's body was dug up and driven in a bakery truck to Madrid, where Juan Perón was living. Carlos Spadoni, a businessman and confidant of Perón, was present when the body arrived. He, Perón, and a gardener placed the body on a marble-topped table. Juan's third wife, Isabel, cleaned the body, combing and blow-drying the hair over several days. Eva's body had been damaged from improper storage, but may also have been beaten on the face at one point. The tip of a finger was missing. The body remained in the Perón house for the next 3 years. In 1973, the Peronists returned to power, and Juan returned from exile in Spain to become president again. He died in 1974 and was buried at La Chacarita Cemetery. Juan Perón's body was also disturbed after death, like his wife. On the 10th of June 1987, robbers stole his sword and other possessions buried with the body, and then used a chainsaw to cut off his hands. A ransom note for $8 million for the appendages was sent, but some think the event was a ritual intended to cause eternal unrest for Juan's spirit. The desecrators were not identified, but assumed to have been linked to the Dirty War, a state terrorism which occurred after the fall of the Peronist government in 1976. Pedro Aramburu, who had succeeded Perón in 1955 as president, was kidnapped and murdered in 1970. In 1974, his body was stolen and held for ransom, the condition being the repatriation of the body of Eva Perón. Isabel Perón, who had succeeded her husband, arranged for this, and Aramburu's body was dumped in a Buenos Aires street. Evita's body was returned to Argentina in 1974 and buried at La Recoleta Cemetery, under 20 feet of concrete and steel, finally at rest. Pedro Martínez de Luna y Pérez de Gótor, 1328 to 1423, was an anti-pope known as Benedict XIII, from 1394 to 1423. The medieval papacy was often in conflict with monarchs claiming temporal power on earth as well as spiritual. There were often factions at odds within as well. Philip IV of France, seeking to bolster his treasury, imposed taxes on the clergy as well as imposing other laws upon them, for which Pope Boniface VIII excommunicated the king. Philip responded by sending troops to attack the Pope's residence, and on the 7th of September 1303 the Pope was taken prisoner. He was physically abused for 3 days before release, and died of a fever on the 11th of October. His successor, Benedict XI, lifted the excommunication on the French king, but died in July 1304. There followed a year-long dispute between French and Italian cardinals on who should be pope. Finally, in June 1305, a Frenchman became Clement V. Rather than go to Rome to reside, he stayed in France and established the papacy at Avignon, where it remained until 1376, when Gregory XI returned to Rome. Gregory died in 1378, and the Roman people, fearing a French pope would be elected and return the papacy to Avignon, besieged the cardinals in a riot and demanded an Italian pope. Urban VI, Archbishop of Bari, was duly elected, but proved hostile to the cardinals, leading to a schism. In opposition, some of the cardinals elected Clement VII as anti-pope at Avignon. On his death, Benedict XIII began his reign as Pope over France, Aragon, Castile, Naples, and Scotland, while the Roman popes ruled the rest of the Catholic realms. From 1409 to 1415, a third papacy was established in Pisa, which is now considered invalid also, though not at the time. Benedict died when he was 94 and was buried at Pensacola Castle, but later his body was moved to Iluka. It was here during the War of the Spanish Succession between 1701 and 1714 that his body was destroyed by French soldiers, who threw the bones into a river, only the skull surviving, which was kept in the palace of the Counts of Aguilo. In April 2000, two brothers, aged 19 and 23, stole the skull and sent a ransom demand of 1 million pesetas to the mayor of Iluka. Police recovered the skull in September 2000, and in November of that year the thieves were sent to prison for 6 months. The skull was transferred to the Zaragoza Museum for safekeeping. Friedrich Wilhelm Plump was another famous man whose skull was stolen following his death. He was born in Germany in 1888, and as a young man became obsessed with the stage and cinema. Changing his name to F.W. Murnau, he flew in the Imperial German Flying Corps in World War I, surviving 8 crashes before being captured and held as a prisoner of war in Switzerland. Returning to Germany, he and actor Conrad Veidt established a film studio, making their first feature film in 1919. Following a version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde called The Janus Head, he made the unlicensed version of Dracula called Nosferatu in 1922. In 1924 he made The Last Laugh, and in 1926 Faust, both starring Emma Jannings. All but the first film, which is lost, are considered classics of world cinema. Emigrating to Hollywood in 1926, he joined Fox Studios. His first American film was Sunrise, which, although not a financial success, nevertheless won 3 Oscars at the first Academy Awards, and is today considered one of the best films of all time. His final film was Taboo, filmed in French Polynesia in 1931. On the 10th of March 1931, Murnau was in a hire car being driven by his valet along the Pacific Coast Highway, when a truck suddenly veered across their lane. The car hit an embankment in avoiding a collision and flung the passengers out. Murnau hit his head and died the next day in Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital. His body was sent home to Germany and buried at Southwest Cemetery in Stahnsdorf near Berlin in April. The grave was desecrated in the 1970s and in February 2015. In July 2015, the grave was rifled again by unknown persons, who this time took his skull. Candle wax found at the site led to speculation that some type of occult ritual had taken place, although it could have been used for illumination. The skull was still missing as of October 2022. Pancho Villa, 1878 to 1923, was a Mexican revolutionary nicknamed the Mexican Napoleon and the Lion of the North. Born José Doroteo Arango Arambula, his early life in Durango is somewhat murky due to differing accounts. He claimed that his real father was a bandit named Agustin Villa, but it appears nobody knew who his real father was. He left school after his sharecropper stepfather died to help his mother on the farm, working a variety of jobs such as mule skinner, butcher and bricklayer in his youth, before becoming a bandit. In his memoirs, he claimed that when he was 16 he tracked down and killed a man who had raped his sister, before stealing a horse and fleeing to the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains. He was arrested in 1902 for assault and stealing mules. His punishment was forced enlistment in the army. However, after a few months, he deserted. In 1903, he killed an army officer and stole the man's horse. It was around this time he was known as Francisco Pancho Villa, or La Cucaracha. Villa continued his thievery mixed with honest labour. At one time he worked as a miner. In 1910, the Mexican Revolution opposed to the rule of General Diaz who had been president since 1884, broke out. Vila took part in battles, sometimes victoriously, other times defeated, which led to the resignation of Diaz in 1911. Despite being disappointed that the incoming president, Madeiro's, failure to deliver land reforms, Vila continued to fight on his side, under the command of General Huerta. Huerta initially welcomed Vila, but found him someone not able to be dominated or controlled, and so decided to eliminate him. Framing him for horse theft, Vila was sentenced to death by firing squad. He was able to contact two brothers of the president, who were also generals, who ordered that he be imprisoned, not executed. Vila escaped prison on Christmas Day 1912 and fled to El Paso, Texas. He had learnt of a coup attempt and tried to get word to Madeiro, but in vain. Madeiro was murdered in February 1913, and Huerta became president. It was during this time that Vila became famous, meeting with the American writers Ambrose Bierce and John Reed. Although he took to robbing trains, including stealing 122 bars of silver from Wells Fargo on one occasion, he gained a reputation as a Robin Hood-type figure for his generosity to the poor. By 1916, however, he was raiding American border towns. In March, Columbus, New Mexico was looted and burned, with 10 civilians dying. Other attacks occurred in Texas in the summer of 1916. 5,000 troops under General Pershing were sent to capture him. Although they failed in this, the raids were suppressed. With the assassination of President Carranza in 1920, Vila's time as a guerrilla fighter ceased. On the 20th of July 1923, Vila, his secretary, his chauffeur, and 2 bodyguards were ambushed in his 1919 Dodge Tourer and shot dead. The reason was possibly that Vila had said he was thinking of standing for election in 1924. He was buried in the cemetery at Parral, Chihuahua, the next day. In June 1926, a young girl passing through the cemetery discovered that somebody had dug up Vila's body and beheaded it. The corpse left lying on the pile of earth beside the broken coffin, half out of the grave. A note attached to a stick stuck in the ground read, "Pancho's head has been taken to Columbus, where we are going to get $5,000 for it." Nobody took the note seriously. Yaqui Indian trackers identified the footsteps of 5 men in the graveyard, but could follow them no further than the boundary of the cemetery. An American mining engineer named Emil Holmdahl was arrested and tried for the crime, but quickly acquitted. Although nobody knows why Vila's corpse was beheaded, it was rumoured the missing head was in the possession of Yale's Skull and Bones Society. The rest of Vila's body was removed to a monument to the Mexican Revolution in Mexico City in 1976. Benito Mussolini, 1883 to 1945, was born in Italy to a blacksmith father and schoolteacher mother. As a young man, he followed his father's socialist leanings. He read widely and was considered an intellectual, attending the University of Lausanne. He worked as a teacher and a journalist, writing essays and a novel, continuing to write news reports until 1935. He was imprisoned for 2 weeks in Switzerland in 1903 for advocating a violent strike. In 1904 in Geneva, he was again imprisoned for falsifying papers, and in 1911 was jailed for joining a riot against Italy's war in Libya. In World War I, he initially supported the Italian neutrality, before supporting the war and serving in the army, leading to his expulsion from the Socialist Party in 1914. His outlook altered completely, from class conflict to supporting revolutionary nationalism, which gradually coalesced into Mussolini declaring himself a National Socialist. Beginning in 1917, he was paid by British intelligence to publish pro-war propaganda, as Britain saw Italy as an unreliable ally. Following the war, he reformed the Italian Fascist Party, which quickly grew in popularity. In October 1922, the fascists demanded the resignation of the Liberal Prime Minister, who requested the King declare martial law. The King refused, leading to the resignation of the Prime Minister, whose post was then offered to Mussolini. By 1925, Italy was virtually a one-party police state, with a personality cult centred on Mussolini. He aspired to create a new Roman Empire in Africa and southern Europe. He urged the Italian people to increase their birth rate, aiming to change the population of the country from 40 to 60 million to provide the necessary population for war. Italian colonists were sent to Libya, which had been taken from the Ottoman Empire, during a war with Italy in 1912, during the late 1920s and early 30s. Native Libyans were slaughtered in their thousands during the colonisation. In 1933, he planned to simultaneously attack France and Yugoslavia with the aid of Germany. A plan halted when it was learnt the French had intercepted and cracked Italian military codes. In the late 1930s, he channeled huge resources to assist General Franco to victory in the Spanish Civil War. In October 1935, Ethiopia was invaded to provide more land for Italian colonisation. A policy of terror and execution, similar to that used in Libya, resulted in the death of 7% of the Ethiopian population by 1941. Sanctions by other nations against Italy were used by Mussolini to justify a pact with Germany, which, when World War II erupted in 1939, guaranteed Italy would be embroiled as part of the so-called Axis powers, despite Britain's desire that Italy be allied to their side. By July 1943, the war had come home to the Italian peninsula. The Allies had landed in Sicily, Rome had come under aerial bombardment, and the Italian army was obviously going to capitulate sooner or later. Mussolini met with the king on the 25th of July 1943 and was sacked as Prime Minister and arrested. His replacement, Marshal Badoglio, immediately signed an armistice with the Allies. The German army still in Italy took control, and the king and Badoglio fled to Malta. Mussolini was rescued by the Germans on the 12th of September 1943 and restored to power over the Salo Republic in northern Italy. He spent time writing his autobiography, realising that time was short as the war raged on. On the 27th of April 1945, Mussolini, his mistress Clara Petacci, and 13 associates were on their way to Switzerland when they were recognised and stopped at Dongo by communist partisans. As part of the armistice, Mussolini was meant to be handed over to Allied forces. Instead, he and his group were summarily shot the next day. The bodies were dumped in Milan on the 29th of April and kicked and spat upon by ordinary Italians. They were then hung upside down at a petrol station and stoned. He was buried in Naguaa Cemetery. On the 22nd of April 1946, his body was dug up from his unmarked grave. A note left nearby announced the remains had been taken by the Democratic Fascist Party and said in part, "Finally, O Duce, you are with us. We will surround you with roses, but the perfume of your virtues will be stronger than that of the roses. Our party has been obliged to begin this fight against red violence." The grave robbers had not been thorough. One of Mussolini's legs had been left behind in the grave. Once released from his confessional secrecy, a Franciscan friar, Father Alberto, informed the police where the body was. It was announced on the 13th of August 1946. It had been recovered in 2 rubberized sacks in a cupboard in a ground floor cell at Pavia Monastery, 20 miles from Milan. The body had only been moved a few days earlier from San Angelo Monastery. 2 monks and 3 other men were taken in for questioning. The body was removed to the Milan police station and then hidden away again in a monastery until 1957. In that year, Mussolini's widow had the body moved to the family mausoleum at Predappio, where today up to 100,000 people a year visit the last resting place of Il Duce. Charlie Chaplin was one of the biggest movie stars of the 20th century. Born in London in 1889, he began his 75-year-long acting career as a boy in extreme poverty. Having ventured to Hollywood in the early days, he was at his zenith between 1914 and 1928, in the silent era, when he was the most famous actor in the world. A century later, and his little tramp character is instantly recognisable. His output dropped markedly after sound came to films, making only 7 movies between 1931 and 1967, but which included classics such as City Lights, Modern Times, The Great Dictator, and Limelight. Much of his fall in popular opinion was based on allegations of communist sympathies and his marriages to women much younger than himself. His first 2 wives were 16 and 15 when he began relationships with them. His 4th marriage was to 18-year-old Una O'Neill, who was 36 years younger than him, but it lasted 34 years until his death, and produced 8 children. Chaplin wrote the lyrics for This Is My Song, a deliberately old-fashioned tune meant to be included in his final film. Only an instrumental version was ultimately included, but British singer Petula Clark reluctantly recorded the song in 1967. It became a #1 hit in the UK, Australia, Ireland, Rhodesia, South Africa, Malaysia and Singapore, and charted well in many other countries. Chaplin died on Christmas 1977 at his home in Switzerland. He was buried at Coursières-sur-Vevey Cemetery on the 27th of December in a simple family ceremony. On the 3rd of March 1978, the gravedigger who had buried the old actor arrived at work to discover a crime. Someone had stolen the entire oak coffin containing the remains. Police were inundated with phone calls and letters with helpful tips and theories. One strong thought was that British fans had dug up the body so that Chaplin could be interred in his native land. Then a series of anonymous phone calls were placed to police, and Chaplin's lawyer demanding $2.5 million for the return of the body. When the ransom was denied, the corpse stealers lowered their price to a mere $1 million. Eventually the Chaplin family were phoned, and the younger children threatened with violence if the money wasn't handed over. Phone booths in Lausanne were monitored, and one of the culprits caught while making a call. 2 men, Roman Vardas, a 25-year-old unemployed Polish mechanic in financial trouble, and Gancho Ganev, a 38-year-old Bulgarian, were revealed to be responsible, and the body of Chaplin unearthed from a cornfield near Neuville in May and reburied 11 weeks after it was stolen in the original cemetery, but this time in a theft-proof concrete tomb. On the 15th of December 1978, Vardas was sentenced to 4.5 years for extortion. Ganev got an 18-month suspended sentence.